Hello, citizens of Skull Island, and welcome to Circuit Court Entertainment, where we look at how laws and history affect all forms of media. I'm your host, Mina, and today we are looking at one of cinema's most gigantic battles, the battle over King Kong. Because just like the ape himself, this story is huge. Let's get started. And to get started, we go back to 1899 or 1900, which I believe is the earliest we have gone yet on this podcast. And like the Clive Cussler books, we're going back to get some context for later. Marion C. Cooper was 6 years old at this time when he received a book about animals in equatorial Africa. He was fascinated by gorillas in particular. When he grew up, he started working for RKO Pictures, an early motion picture company and one of the major film companies of the day, along with Universal, Fox, WB, etc. One day when he was on a shoot, he saw some baboons, which reignited his old passion for gorillas. And then when you throw in seeing planes fly over a tall building, since passenger planes weren't a thing until the late 20s and early 30s, and was still very uncommon, along with hearing a naturalist talk about Komodo dragons, well, you can see how King Kong became a mishmash of these important details of his life while he was in a position to make the movie he really wanted to see. So, in 1931, he wrote and published the first treatment of King Kong as a book. The movie debuted in 1933 and at that time was a complete smash hit. There were no real box office numbers released, but there was a sequel released 9 months later, Song of Kong. King Kong's impressive use of stop motion, rear projection, puppetry, and other practical effects set the movie special effects industry on a new path. In fact, Ray Harryhausen, the master of stop motion animation and special effects, was inspired by seeing King Kong to go on his own special effects journey, and that profoundly changed cinema and elevated stop motion even further, mostly but not exclusively in America. In fact, Jurassic Park was debating on stop motion versus 3D. While 3D went out in 2023, Universal Studios Orlando had a brief area showing off the history of Jurassic Park, and the clay models were on display. And I think some of the actual test footage made its way onto DVD extras. To get back to the point, though, King Kong almost immediately found itself in a lot of legal trouble. Marion C. Cooper was under the impression that had simply licensed King Kong to RKO Pictures, and they had made the film. He left RKO to join a different company called Pioneer Pictures in 1933, and in 1935 attempted to make a Tarzan vs. King Kong movie with Pioneer, only to find things less clear. Things completely fell apart when the news of the 1962 Godzilla vs. King Kong movie reached Cooper, something he absolutely did not sign off on. King Kong did debut in Japan in 1933 in English with Japanese subtitles. Cooper held that he created King Kong, and that the seeds of Kong harkened back to when he was 6 years old. He let RKO make 2 pictures, Kong and Son of Kong, but they had no other rights. They especially did not have the rights to license Kong out to Toho in Japan, or to make models or merch of Kong without his knowledge or him receiving a cut of the profits. Unfortunately, it was not to be. According to his own account, he had a lot of circumstantial evidence, but the key documents disappeared while he was serving in World War II. However, he's also known as a teller of tall tales, so the veracity of that is unknown. Either way, without the proof, he had no claim to King Kong. And then, it was quiet. But we should probably talk about RKO. RKO Pictures was founded in 1929 and was a major player in early Hollywood. It eventually went defunct in 1959, but before then was known for its wide array of films and filmmakers. It made such celebrated films as The Above King Kong, one of my favorite comedies, Bringing Up Baby, possibly the most important film of all time, Citizen Kane. They also created and released all of the Fred Rogers and Ginger Astaire movies, except for one Rogers and Astaire did at MGM, and RKO released Disney films starting with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937 and continued through 1954 when Disney decided to distribute on their own. But things did not always go as planned. Bringing Up Baby was a flop at that time, and several other films really did not do as well as planned. Howard Hughes bought the studio in 1948 on top of the growing threats of McCarthyism, which actually blacklisted at least 2 of their directors early on, and TV started to be a threat to the entire film industry. It was all RKO could do to barely hold out. Hughes was eventually kicked out in 1955, but even a brief burst working on the TV side of things and a few modest hits could not save the studio, and it closed as a studio in 1959. However, it still held its enormous library, and quite frankly, it did hold one king-size card. Every now and then, 2 things develop at the same time. By all accounts, these people have nothing to do with each other, or at least little enough it doesn't matter. For example, Isaac Newton is cited as the inventor of calculus, but other people such as Gottfried Leibniz also found out about it at around the same time. Or why Wild Arms and Final Fantasy VII have pretty much the same plot and plot beats, but Wild Arms takes place in the futuristic Old West with aliens, because video games, and came out only 2 months later. No, I will not shut up about how Wild Arms is a good game, and Rudy, Jack, and Cecilia are a fantastic group. By all accounts, this is what happened with King Kong in the 70s. Both Paramount and Universal decided they wanted to make a Kong remake and approached RKO. And for some reason, RKO approved both, and didn't tell either of them, which led to both sides of basically finding out at around the same time the other was doing a remake. You can see how that also got messy. So, to back up a smidge, I mentioned in the public domain episode that before things got standardized with the Copyright Act of 1976, same year the King Kong remake came out, by the way, things were a little bit more chaotic. The copyrights before then were not a standardized X many years after release, as it is now, but rather a matter of every number of years after release, copyright renewals would be filed. If the file didn't make it in time, or something happened to delay it, or heck, if the person who owned it didn't think it was worth it to renew, the item went to public domain. Which is why the pre-70 items in the public domain are a bit of a mess. His Go Friday is in the public domain, but the Philadelphia story, which came out at the same year, does not seem to be. Marion C. Cooper had published a book treatment of King Kong, and that had fallen into the public domain since it hadn't been renewed. Universal City Studios versus RKO was a drawn-out case. I ended up contacting the California branch of the National Archives, and they said they had 10 cubic feet, or approximately 15,000 pages of relevant documents I could read in person, drawn-out case. Eventually, it was proven that RKO made the deal with Paramount, but Universal was allowed to make their own King Kong story as long as everything they used was in the public domain. And if you are going, wait, King Kong won't be in the public domain until 2029, you're partially correct. The movie won't enter into the public domain until then. In something Universal will kick themselves over later, they managed to successfully argue that the King Kong book had gone into the public domain, which was true. And because of that, any plot points that were in the book were fair game. And while the book is based on an earlier draft, the only real major difference is how King Kong dies. In that version, King Kong jumps off the Empire State Building to grab an airplane instead of being shot and falling off like in the movie. Well, that and a handful of small name changes and secondary character tweaks. Nothing huge. The other part of this is the Lanham Trademark Act. So I've talked about trademarks in my public domain episode. To recap, trademarks are forever. But there are some additional notes, such as there are no secondary meanings and it must not place competitors at a disadvantage. So as an example, let's look at the New York Mets logo. The blue and orange cursive logo is highly specific to the Mets only. Using it on other items can make people think the Mets approved it, and it in no way causes a competitive advantage to the team. Actually, going by last year's record, it may even be a disadvantage. So, to tie it back to Kong, Universal argued that King Kong couldn't really be trademarked because giant gorillas were not distinctive enough to be trademarked. The King Kong beats were very distinctive, but humanity has told tales of giant animals for ages. Think Jormungandr from Norse mythology. A snake so big he circles the entire earth. He very much predates Kong. With those two rules brought into play, Universal was told they could make their own movie, provided it followed the rules above. And they tried. For a long time. In fact, one of the people they reached out to was a young filmmaker named Peter Jackson in the 1990s. So far, that initial version of Universal's Kong film hasn't really been made. After it was brought to the appellate court, it was eventually settled and RKO and Universal agreed to pay various percentages and not sue anyone over the movie. The 1976 Kong is fine. It's fine. And gets changed to an aspiring actress named Dwan, who was found after her own boat was wrecked. The Empire State Building gets changed to the then recent Twin Towers. The effects were famously attempted to be upgraded, but the plan didn't really work out and was in fact mostly a man named Rick Baker in a monkey suit with an animatronic face. The producer was Dino De Laurentiis, who was a character typical of the 70s producing types, and with his own list of production stories, including a lot of stuff involving Hannibal and The Evil Dead. In 1976, King Kong made $95 million or $494 million today. In other words, a little over twice the amount of Sahara's adjusted for inflation of $189 million. It was the fourth highest grossing movie of the year. It was competing with Rocky. And while a solid movie, doesn't really hold a candle to the original. But since it was around 40 years after the original debuted and was only the second real King Kong movie, it did have its fans. And there was also a South Korean movie released in the same year in the US called Ape, which may be a parody of Kong, and Dino De Laurentiis sued them, but I won't get into it. Besides, it was decided they weren't similar enough to actually cause problems. Listen, I have so much more to go. In 1976, a court case happened that apparently proved Cooper right, and his son got the rights, which he immediately sold to Universal for $200,000 or over $1 billion today. Inflation's a real pain, huh? Universal took a while to use Kong, but he did make appearances in a ride for the Universal Studios backlot tour in Hollywood. Costumes, a balloon in the Empire State Building, and a Tiger Electronic wristwatch video game. Which leads into my next subject. No, we are not done. In my episode on Doom, I brushed over the great video game crash of 1983. The reasons that led up to it are complicated, but the short version is that while video games were successful, the market was overflooded, especially when it came to home consoles. Video games did manage to pull themselves out of it, and it was partly due to one particular game, Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong was released in 1981, ahead of the video game crash, and was one of the main things to keep steady through it. The game is unabashedly inspired by King Kong and consists of a giant gorilla kidnapping a lady, then climbing up a building. Our player character, Mario, then known as Jumpman, has to avoid obstacles to get to the giant ape. Which is why, in 1985, Universal sued them over the Donkey Kong name. Well, and the argument that Donkey Kong arcade game was just a ripoff of King Kong. I'm going to brush over the fact here that initially the Donkey Kong game was actually going to be a licensed game for Popeye. Mario was Popeye, Donkey Kong was Bluto, and Pauline, Princess Peach's predecessor, was Olive Oil. Just know that the licensing fell through, so it was hastily reworked into original characters. According to the actual court documents in front of me, the creator of Mario, Shigeru Miyamoto, said in his deposition that he had seen King Kong a few times since the 1933 movie was released in Japan that same year with subtitles, and it had been released and shown on TV, plus at least one movie had Kong fighting Godzilla, and the game wasn't really intended to be a remake of the movie. According to the documents, the Japanese creators thought that Kong meant ape, and by consulting a Japanese to English dictionary, they found that donkey apparently meant stupid or goofy. Or looking up stupid, and they found the word donkey. While King Kong was undoubtedly an inspiration for Donkey Kong, he wasn't intended as a stand-in. And that goes back to Layhem. No one was confusing Donkey Kong as a King Kong game. The arcade cabinet said Nintendo, the name Donkey Kong was splashed all over the cabinets, and the pre-game animation was clearly inspired by Donkey Kong, but it wasn't them sneaking it past copyright. There was no confusion, which is part one of the 1-2 punch. Because to go back to the Universal versus RKO fight, Nintendo successfully argued that it didn't really matter anyway, as parts of Kong were already present in the public domain. The name was public domain. The idea of a giant ape climbing a building was public domain, helped by the fact that even then, Donkey Kong's size wasn't as big as King Kong, And the people from King Kong never had to deal with barrels and the building being under construction. There were no planes. Kong doesn't die, as it's an arcade game with no end, and Mario doesn't look anything like either of Anne and Dwan's human love interests. Nintendo, at that time a very small Japanese company, destroyed Universal. It's been told that Nintendo, in thanks, named their character Kirby after the Marion lawyer John Kirby. And it's partially true. According to an interview years later, Miyamoto said that Kirby was on a list of names for that character because they found the pink puffball having a name starting with K and using RB combo to be funny. The fact that it was the same as their lawyer that saved them years ago just sealed the deal. And that is mostly where it stands now. The King Kong Backlot Tour attraction was added to Universal Studios Florida as an opening day attraction called Kongfrontation in 1990. It was mostly based on the 1975 Paramount movie version, somehow. And while well-liked, it had enough problems and was growing dated, so in 2004, Revenge of the Mummy replaced it. In 2005, that Peter Jackson version of King Kong finally came out. It was his blank check for doing The Lord of the Rings, and this was the first King Kong movie I saw. It made $556.9 million, or roughly $885 million today, or 7 to 8 times as much as Sahara. But with a large budget, it really wasn't a huge financial success. It was, however, nominated for several awards such as visual effects and art direction, and Jack Black was snubbed from a nomination for Best Supporting Actor, as his turn as Carl Denham is shockingly amoral, entertaining, and greedy. It was fantastic. This one was released by Universal and seems to be generally considered the second best behind the original. It added in a whole hour, but it was used for some massive character development, and Andy Serkis, hot off the arguments that his role as Gollum should have been nominated for Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars, proved it even more with a Kong that was both more human and animal-like as he spent just a lot of time watching how gorillas act. Almost a decade later, in 2014, Legendary Pictures, a subset of Warner Brothers, released Godzilla, remaking the 1954 film. Though instead of Japan, they set it in modern-day America, and made $529 million or $693 million adjusted for inflation, about 3.5 times as much as Sahara. It started the Monsterverse. And while Legendary did announce they had secured the right to other famous kaiju like Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah, that wasn't their next move. Their next movie was Kong Skull Island, and what may be one of the best posters I've ever seen. Kong Skull Island was released in 2017. It made $568 million or $719 million today, or just under 4 times as much as Sahara. It was a period piece taking place late in the Vietnam War and had human beings tricked to intrude on Kong's domain. The interesting thing is, Kong is not referred to as King Kong. He is called Kong and is definitely compared to a king and a god, much like the older films. But no one has said the name King Kong, and he is yet to climb the Empire State Building. But that may be because he's about as tall as Godzilla and is about a quarter as tall as the building itself. Not quite as impressive. Or maybe it's very impressive in a different way. It's all stuff that didn't happen exclusively in the 1933 movie. King Kong will enter in the public domain in the next 5 years, putting this whole ownership debacle to rest. For the most part. No one right now seems to be interested in remaking the original, and Universal and Warner Brothers seem to be happy letting Godzilla and Kong duke it out. It's really a classic kaiju mashup, and humans have lots of stories about giant monsters fighting. But it's honestly funny about how what started off as one guy's inner 6-year-old being indulged ended up becoming hugely influential and has touched pretty much every form of entertainment. Books, movies, TV shows that I didn't talk about because the script is long, video games, merchandise, just so many people have been inspired by this giant ape. Ray Harryhausen, Peter Jackson, and my brother have all cited seeing this movie as why they want to get into film. And I think that's been really special. Now, where's my PS5 remake of Wild Arms? Did King Kong get remade into the modern day? Why can't Rudy? Thank you for listening to Circuit Court Entertainment. If you found this episode interesting, please tell others as this is a new podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review on all the major podcast services. You can find me on Twitter at CCE Pod, and Tumblr at Circuit Court Entertainment. This episode was written, edited, and recorded by me, Mina. The script was edited by CJ Peterson. Podcast art by Empress Cirque on Twitter. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.